Australia and World War II. Australia officially entered World War II on September 3, 1939, accepting Great Britain's declaration of war on Nazi Germany. The country subsequently entered a state of war with other Axis powers, including the Kingdom of Italy in June of 1940 and the Empire of Japan on December 9, 1941, 2 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Throughout the conflict, around 1 million Australians served in the armed forces in the European theatre, the North African Campaign and the Pacific Theatre. But the country itself remained untouched by combat until May 31, 1942, when a fleet of Japanese midget submarines attacked Sydney Harbour. Until then, Australia seemed like it was a safe distance from the fighting that was going on almost everywhere else in the world. The attack on Sydney Harbour and the series of attacks that followed over the next 9 days served as a sobering reminder that almost no human-populated corner of the globe would remain entirely untouched by combat. Japanese conquest in the Pacific. After the infamous bombing of Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7, 1941, Japan sought to expand its targets throughout the Pacific. They embarked on a large-scale offensive with a similar ferocity and relentlessness to the German blitzkrieg that had devastated parts of the West. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, the Philippine capital of Manila, the Malaysian capital of Kuala Lumpur, and Hong Kong had all fallen to the Japanese. In January 1942, Imperial forces overtook an Australian garrison at Rabaul in Papua New Guinea. By late February, the Japanese had barreled their way into multiple other territories, including the Solomon Islands, Burma, now called Myanmar, the Dutch East Indies, Singapore, and the islands of Bali, Timor, and Java. Around the same time, the Japanese sank 12 Allied ships off the Australian cities of Darwin and Broome. The Australian mainland remained untouched for the time being, as the Imperial forces maintained their focus in ongoing conflicts elsewhere, and targeted additional islands including Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka. Some of these campaigns were more successful than others, but Japan's determination to conquer remained terrifyingly consistent. One of the Imperial military's first major setbacks came in the first week of May during its attempt to capture the Papuan capital of Port Moresby from the Allies. By then, Japan had long had its eye on Port Moresby. A victory would severely disrupt Allied supply lines in the region and will enable the Japanese to establish a base from which to launch additional attacks on Australia. But American and Australian forces fiercely defended the harbour, and after several days of fighting, Japan abandoned its mission. The attack on Sydney Harbour. The failed invasion of Port Moresby was a letdown for the Japanese, but it certainly didn't stop them from continuing along their path of conquest. Just weeks later, on the night of May 31, 1942, 3 Ko-Hayoteki-class midget submarines entered Sydney Harbour, with each carrying a 2-man crew. After successfully avoiding the partially constructed Sydney Harbour anti-submarine boom net, the trio of vessels attempted to sink Allied warships. 2 of the submarines, M14 and M21, were detected before they could do any damage. The M14's crew deliberately scuttled their vessel, while the M21 was successfully sunk by the Allies. Rather than face the humiliation of defeat, the M21's crew took their own lives. The third midget sub, M24, tried unsuccessfully to torpedo the American heavy cruiser USS Chicago, but its crew managed to sink the Royal Australian Navy ship HMAS Kutebal, killing 21 sailors and wounding 10 others. The Dutch submarine KIX was damaged by a torpedo during the raid. Nearly 2 months later, it was decommissioned from the Royal Netherlands Navy. The vessel underwent extensive repairs and was commissioned into the Royal Australian Navy under the name HMAS K9 nearly a year later. At the end of the day, there was no real winner of the skirmish. While the Allies suffered greater casualties, it would be fair to say that the attack on Sydney Harbour wasn't as successful as the Japanese had hoped it would be. All 3 midget submarines and their combined 6 crew members were lost in the raid, in addition to several losses that the Japanese incurred shortly before the attack. The Imperial Navy originally planned to carry out the raid using 6 larger submarines, which made up what was known as the Eastern Attack Group on the 8th Submarine Squadron. On May 11th, roughly 3 weeks before the attack, 4 of the submarines were dispatched to the Japanese base at Trug Lagoon in the Caroline Islands with instructions to each pick up a midget submarine. One of the larger submarines was torpedoed on its way to Truk by the American sub USS Tautog. One of the fleet's 5 remaining submarines was forced to return to Truk within a day of leaving for Sydney, when the battery compartment in the midget submarine it was transporting exploded, destroying the midget and killing its pilot. After picking up a replacement midget sub, the larger vessel rejoined the 4 other mother submarines in the waters off Sydney. After the attack, midget subs M14 and M21 were recovered shortly after the attack on Sydney Harbour. The remains of the vessel's 4 crew members were cremated and treated with full naval honours in hopes that it would compel the Japanese government to treat its Australian prisoners of war more humanely. The M24's fate remained unknown for 64 years. The mystery was finally solved in 2006 when scuba divers discovered the wrecked submarine off Sydney's northern beaches. Despite their shortcomings, the Imperial forces remained undeterred. The 5 mother submarines waited for 3 days for the midget submarines to return following the attack. When it became evident that they'd most likely met with disaster, the crews of the larger subs refocused their efforts, embarking on a month-long campaign to disrupt merchant shipping in the waters off Eastern Australia. At least 7 Allied merchant ships were attacked in the weeks following the Sydney Harbour raid. 3 vessels were sunk and 50 sailors were killed. Roughly a week after the failed attack on Sydney, on the morning of June 8th, 2 of the Japanese subs bombarded the ports at Sydney and Newcastle. The attacks began shortly after midnight, when the Japanese submarine I-24 surfaced 9 miles off the Sydney coast and fired 10 shells over a 4-minute period. 9 of the shells landed in Sydney's eastern suburbs, while the 10th landed in the water. Thankfully, only 1 of them detonated. But no lives were lost, and the shelling resulted only in minor injuries like cuts and fractures, which were caused by broken glass, falling bricks, and other damage to homes and other buildings that were struck by the unexploded shells. A few hours later, at around 2:15 in the morning, submarine I-21 shelled Newcastle from a little more than 5.5 miles offshore. The crew fired 34 shells over a 16-minute period in an attempt to destroy a major steelworks facility. Much like the earlier attack, only 1 of the shells detonated, causing damage to a house, while an unexploded shell struck a tram terminal. There were no deaths or major injuries. To this day, the 2 raids on Sydney and the bombardment in Newcastle were the only attacks on the cities to occur in recorded history. During the attack on Newcastle, the Australian military returned fire from a coastal defence installation at Fort Scratchley, marking the only time in history that an Australian land fortification fired on an enemy warship during wartime. The submarine was undamaged. A lucky outcome. The outcomes of the attack on Sydney Harbour and the bombardments that followed could have turned out much worse for the Allies. Historians have been quick to point out that the Japanese paid a relatively large price in the form of lost submarines and wasted efforts in exchange for minimal gains. And while any loss of life is undeniably tragic, the destruction of 3 Allied merchant ships and a Royal Australian Navy vessel did little, if anything, to change the big picture. The Allies were doubly fortunate for the fact that they experienced minimal setbacks despite doing an arguably poor job at responding to the attacks. They weren't prepared for the raid on Sydney Harbour or the ensuing bombardments, nor were they expecting any of it, even though the warning signs were there. Prior to the attack, there were numerous warnings of Japanese activity off Australia's east coast, yet the Allied forces who were tasked with protecting the shoreline failed to take appropriate action. Instead, they ignored the red flags or came up with explanations pointing away from the possibility of an impending Japanese attack. Even high-ranking naval officers who were in the area on the night of the attack shirked any notion of an imminent raid. In the hours leading up to the attack, Royal Navy Rear Admiral Gerard Charles Muirhead Gould hosted a dinner party. One of the main guests was Captain Howard Bode of the USS Chicago, the highest-ranking US Navy officer stationed in Sydney Harbour at the time. Both men reportedly doubted that an attack was in the works. Around midnight, Mirhead Gould boarded the Royal Navy vessel HMAS Lolita. He later said he was trying to learn more details about the situation at hand, but crew members claimed that he chastised them for reporting their suspicions of a Japanese raid. Junior officers aboard the USS Chicago made similar allegations toward Captain Bode, and members of both crews accused the men of being drunk. The officers finally began to take the claims of an attack seriously after the HMAS Kutebol was torpedoed. In addition to what's been described as the incompetent leadership of Mirhead Gould and Bode, some historians also blame poor communication for the flawed Allied response to the raid. Even after the Japanese midget submarine M14 was spotted in the harbor, more than 2 hours passed before Mirhead Gould issued the first order for the ships under his command to carry out anti-submarine actions. It took 2 more hours for the Navy to mobilize its auxiliary patrol boats and another hour for the vessels to leave their anchorage area. None of the boats were equipped with radio communications, forcing their operators to rely on signal lights and smaller boats for further instruction. The unseen damage. All things considered, luck undoubtedly played a role in the lack of death and destruction that the Allies experienced during the attacks on Sydney and Newcastle. So, it's easy to assume that everyone in the immediate area breathed a collective sigh of relief once all was said and done. But not all of the damage inflicted by violence is physical. In fact, the effects of the midget submarine attack and the ensuing bombardments were mostly psychological. Prior to the initial raid on Sydney Harbour, Australians weren't overly worried about the prospect of an attack on the country's soil. Some experts have even described the overall consensus as a feeling of immunity to violence at the hands of the Japanese or other Axis powers. For the first several years of the war, the fighting took place in areas that felt an entire world away from Australia. But as the war in the Pacific expanded, the threat of a Japanese attack on the country increased substantially. In hindsight, some might have even argued that the violence against the nation was a predictable part of Japan's plans for conquest throughout the Pacific. Most people remained blissfully unconcerned about the looming danger that was encroaching upon the region, and the reality of the situation didn't sink in until enemy fire struck the mainland. This false sense of safety may seem deliberately ignorant, but it's actually understandable, and civilians weren't necessarily at fault for their lack of fear. For example, mainstream news didn't travel as fast or as far back then as it does today. The midget submarine attack on Sydney wasn't mentioned in the newspaper until more than a day after it occurred, because on the morning of the attack, that day's edition of the paper had already been written up and slated for publication. Any mention of the raid that appeared in newspapers the following day was brief, vague, and tucked inconspicuously into the inner pages. To give you an idea, the loss of the HMAS Kutebol was described as one small harbour vessel of no military value. There was no mention of the 21 lives lost, courtesy of a strictly imposed federal censorship banning the disclosure of what really happened. Meanwhile, the front page featured a distracting headline about the Royal Air Force's successful bombing of the German city of Cologne. People were certainly not ignorant or unaware of the fact that a very large, destructive and deadly war was taking place. But the Australian government's heavy-handed control over the media's disclosure of information begs the question of how much the country's citizens actually knew about what was going on in the Pacific arena and elsewhere throughout the globe. In an era without cell phones, the internet, or more than a handful of cable TV channels, civilians had fewer ways of obtaining information than a person in today's world can probably imagine. If the threat posed by the Japanese wasn't mentioned in their news sources, then it makes sense that the vast majority of people continue to live their lives in a way that may seem naive or even flippant from the outside looking in. Regardless of whether or not they should have seen it coming, the attacks traumatized civilians and dramatically altered their perception of the war and the dangers it posed. Throughout the remainder of the conflict, Australia's citizens remained on high alert amid ever-heightening fears that the Japanese would eventually return to wreak havoc on Australia's coastal cities. Thankfully, that didn't happen. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you next time. Bye.